Good evening. Welcome to Cross and Crown. We are really excited that you guys are joining us tonight. Tonight is the first night of a three-part lecture series, and I'm assuming some of you have very much caught wind of that. And so tonight, next week, and in 3 weeks, we will discuss topics in regards to, is it reasonable to believe in God? My name is Matthias. I am one of the pastors here at Cross and Crown, and we welcome you. We're excited that we're able to do this, and our hope is that this is going to be a helpful lecture series for you. We want to include you in the process of this evening. And so what we've put in your seats is these little things, and this QR code. You can just use the camera. If you have an updated phone, unlike me, with an iPhone 6 and OS 10. So if you're like beyond that, then the camera on your iPhone or your Samsung or your LG or whatever will actually scan this and lead you to a woo-foo form where you can fill in a question that you might have for Dr. Axe. Okay, so that is one way you can scan it with a QR reader. You can enter the bit.ly code that we have on the screen, or you can enter the text message number, and you can send in your question, and then that way you don't have to encounter the scary microphone right here to my right and left. If you're feeling good about asking a question in person, we'll let you do it that way as well. Again, so glad that you guys are here. Without further ado, I'd love to invite our guest speaker for the evening, Dr. Doug Axe. Would you join me up here?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It is a delight for me to be here. And I think it's also a delight to see the church engaging big issues where the church and the world are very much in disagreement, and those are precisely the issues that we need to be talking about and bringing to the forefront. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my own story before I get started, how I came to be doing the work that I do. I grew up not in a Christian home, in a family that didn't attend church more than once a year, maybe Easter Sunday, and then all of a sudden, my parents heard the gospel for the first time, started taking the whole family to church. I was a teenager, I was 14, and within a period of months, a whole family of 6 had become Christians. I was baptized by the age of 15, along with my parents and the whole family. 4 years later, I embarked on studies of chemical engineering at UC Berkeley. And so that was the point where I found, for the first time, a tension between the way I had come to understand the world as a believer now and a young believer, and the way that the professors who were teaching courses at UC Berkeley were understanding the world. And in some respects, those are compatible, but it was evident to me that there were some respects in which at least some of these professors thought that they were very incompatible. A chemistry professor in particular used a lecture on thermodynamics to lecture the students against belief in God and was arguing against an argument for the existence of God. And I had probably the good sense not to challenge him at the time, but I thought, I'm going to come back to this because I don't think he's actually making strong arguments, and it would be good for someone to go and do the science carefully and address those arguments. Well, the Lord must have heard that desire and honored it. Many years later, I was able to embark on a course of study, as I was doing my PhD at Caltech, move it in a direction of studying the information content in individual genes in order to ask rigorously the question of whether the Darwinian process or any naturalistic process could invent the things of life, which I thought was the most experimentally tractable question that could be asked in a lab, and that's what I wanted to do. Many years after that, I ended up with an opportunity to write a book, which came out a couple of years ago. It was this book called Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. And as I was approaching writing the book, I thought about different ways I could write a book. One would be to take all of the 25 years of technical work that had led me to conclude very firmly that accidental processes cannot invent life, and translate the technical science into non-technical terms and write a book that people who don't need a PhD to read it would be able to get some view of the science. But there was something that I wasn't satisfied about in that, and that is there is this misperception, I think, that the question of whether we are or are not accidents, whether we are cosmic accidents, is presented as though it were fundamentally a technical question for the scientist to answer. In other words, you have to have a PhD to know whether you're a cosmic accident or not. There's something very disturbing to me about that, because I feel like questions like that are that fundamental, you don't need a PhD. There's something very obvious, very intuitive, very commonsensical about these things. And maybe even sometimes a PhD gets in the way of seeing these sorts of things clearly. So I decided to write the book from a common sense approach. It talks about intuition. We'll talk a little bit more about intuition. And it connects it to science. So the point I'm making in the book is you don't need to be an expert in the sciences to know that you are not an accident. But you could become an expert and you could study this, and then if you do your work honestly, you'll only find that the results of science confirm your basic intuition that you're not an accident. So I'm going to start just by trying to convince you very quickly that there are questions, and some of them are deep questions, but they're very central questions about which common sense is a very powerful tool, as powerful or more powerful than technical expertise. And one of these is the age-old philosophical question, the question of existence. So philosophers have been wrestling with the nature of existence, what it means to exist, what are the categories of existence for a long time. And one of those was one of the brilliant Greek philosophers, a guy named Gorgias, not because of how he looks, that was his name, who studied existence and devoted his life to that, really. And toward the end of his work, he summarized his conclusion with this: nothing exists. Okay, so he was an expert. We are not experts, and yet I don't think any of you are worrying as though, oh no, maybe I don't exist, because a very smart person in Greece came to the conclusion that nothing exists. And here is a case where common sense tells us that this guy got it wrong. You wouldn't have to read all of his volumes on existence to know that he got it wrong. You could read them if you wanted to, and you would probably find places where he diverted from the truth. And we know he was wrong, and even if some modern thinker were to take up the very same idea, say a physicist were to take up where he left off and come up with a physical theory of non-existence and conclude in the end, therefore, nothing exists, again, you would not need to be able to decipher this. You would not need to be able to say, here's where you went wrong, in order to know that this physicist did go wrong. Common sense tells you that we exist, and therefore some things do exist, and therefore the statement, nothing exists, is false. Well, there's something like that, I think, going on with the question of origins, which is another one of these fundamental basic questions that's been considered from the very beginning of human thought. Here again, I would argue that common sense gives us a very firm grounding in a certain understanding of origins, and very smart people, as smart as Gorgias, we're not saying these people are stupid, very smart people can find themselves disagreeing with something that is just commonsensical. And in that case, you can dialogue with someone without being at their level of expertise and just trying to bring them back to common sense understanding. On this subject of origins, I came across this quote from a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley named Alison Gopnik. She wrote, by elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists. So she's recognizing it's not that parents are teaching kids that the things around us, butterflies, were made by a godlike designer. It's something innate in children. Whatever their background, whatever their parents are saying, they get this, and by age 4, when they see a butterfly, they think of it as something that was made by a godlike designer. Now, Professor Gopnik did not think this was a good thing. I look at this and think, wow, that's neat. We all have this, regardless of our background. She saw it as something that needed to be addressed by bringing contrary education or evolutionary education in much, much earlier. So her idea, and an idea espoused by many, was that we need to start teaching very young children the alternative account of where we came from before the wrong account is too firmly entrenched. And this is, I would say, an elitist view, because it's saying that the elite understanding, that the professors understand origin, our origin, better than the 4-year-olds, and therefore we need to educate the 4-year-olds before their wrong ideas are too firmly entrenched. So if you want to diagram that elitist view, it looks something like this. We're born in this naive state, represented down here in the lowlands on the right. We are not well equipped to understand even the fundamentals of our own existence. And we have to look to the highly educated people of the academy who are equipped, have become equipped to understand these things if we want to understand the truth. And so we look to them, and they dispense the truth, and we're enlightened by it. However, if the 4-year-olds are right, the true diagram, I think, looks more like this. That we come into this world well equipped to understand the most foundational, the most fundamental things. And I'm not saying that 4-year-olds get quantum mechanics. I don't get quantum mechanics. I'm saying very basic things like, am I real? Is this real? Do I exist? Was this butterfly made by a godlike designer? Those are the things that 4-year-olds get and understand very nicely. And in fact, the people in the academy, very brilliant though they are, become stuck in a way of thinking that has been handed to them by their predecessors. And they must think along these lines. And they get in trouble if they think outside these lines, but they find themselves in a ditch. If this view is more correct, it reminds me of a certain children's story about a naked emperor. Because in this story, the fact that so many adults are so concerned about what others think about them is what makes them participate in a falsehood, right, in this story. And it takes a young person who's not playing that game, who doesn't worry about impressions, doesn't worry about reputation, to just call a spade and say that emperor is wearing no clothes. Something like that, I think, is happening in the life sciences, where the people who are most concerned about how they are perceived as a scientist are going to view things one way, and the people who aren't encumbered in that way are going to have a much more free and commonsensical view of reality. So in the book, I introduced something that's called the universal design intuition, which is basically the thing that Alison Gopnik was referring to in that Wall Street Journal article. It is simply this. As makers of things, we instantly recognize things that were made, and we know these things can't be made without know-how. So if you watch small children, if you're a parent who's brought up children, you've seen that from a very early age, children are zeroing in on the things that they want to learn how to do, the things that brother or sister or mother or father do. Very quickly, before 2 years of age, children are seeing, that's what I want to do because I know this is something that you have to learn how to do, and I want to learn how to do it. And they'll get ahead of themselves and try to do things that they can't do yet, but they're very good at noticing the things that you need know-how in order to do. A simple way of stating this in one sentence is, accidents can't do the work of know-how. Only know-how does the work of know-how. So we have these two things. We have a design intuition on the one hand, and this is the thing that we all have from early on, and we have a design deduction, a thing that a scientist would want in order to say, okay, you're right, life is designed. And the question that I'm going to address here, and the question I was wrestling with as I was working on the book is there anything that connects these two? Because you could say, well, an intuition is an intuition. Nobody claims that all intuitions are correct. I certainly don't claim that. So of what value is it to say that all people come into this world understanding that life is designed. They have that intuition because there's all kinds of things that people have intuitions about that are false. So why would we put any weight on this intuition whatsoever? Well, what I'm wondering is whether there's anything that connects that design intuition to a deduction, something that a scientist would recognize as valid and rigorous. And I believe there is, and I'm going to just call it this: unbelievable coincidence. And what happens here is we innately, as humans, have a very keen sense of coincidence. We notice things that are peculiar and cannot be explained by chance. And we do that from a very early age. The interesting thing about coincidence is there is a branch of mathematics, probability, that is the mathematics of coincidence. So not only is there something intuitive about coincidence in that we can all recognize a coincidence that's beyond what should be believed, a remarkable coincidence or too remarkable coincidence, you can also do math to show that one of these claimed coincidences really is too remarkable to be believed. The numbers really don't allow us to believe them. So let me ask, and we will consider here together, what makes a coincidence unbelievable? Certainly there are coincidences that are very believable, but there are some that are way beyond believable. So picture this: someone crumples up a sheet of red paper, throws it on the floor, and it looks like this. Now, when I look at this, I can see, using my imagination, the head of an elephant. I don't know, can you see that? I see a trunk coming down here. I see two big ears. And yet, none of us finds this to be spooky. If we had been there when someone crumbled it and threw it on the floor, we would go, oh my goodness, the head of an elephant. The reason we would not be spooked by this is although we can see that, we're having to squint a little bit and we have to bring our own imagination to the paper, right? You could see something else. You could name several other things that this might look like. It's not utterly compelling, but given the suggestion, you can look at it and you can say, oh, I see what you're saying. Whereas if this piece of paper were on the floor, we know that could not have happened by crumpling the red paper and throwing it on the floor. We know that someone had to do something very clever and very particular in order for a piece of paper to take that form. So there you have a believable coincidence, an unbelievable coincidence. There's no way that happened by accident. We refuse to believe that. But again, is there a way that we can show that that's actually rigorous? The 4-year-old gets that didn't happen by accident. If a 4-year-old had never seen origami and had encountered that on a table, he or she would know right away, someone did this, and again, they would want to know, how do you do it? Let's look at another example, and I use alphabet soup as an example in my book. So, alphabet soup, because it's letters, and they all just spill out there when you pour a bowl of alphabet soup or you make a pot of it, it's possible for things to get spelled in alphabet soup, right? And if you've ever served this to a child, they try to spell things. And we don't think it, we're prepared to believe that certain things could be spelled accidentally, just by coincidence. And you may have spotted some things. There's 3-letter words like sea in there. Sea, hawks. There's no hawks. Sea. And May. And I found a 4-letter word, but it's awkward. It's rose, see? But you have to kind of circle around. None of us think, oh, that's spooky. Someone wanted us to see rose. Because, again, just as with the elephant head, we have to do quite a bit of work to see these words. And they're not very impressive words, right? 3- and 4-letter words, random in their distribution. The A in May is upside down. Rose is kind of a mess, but we can pull these things out. Someone, when I gave this talk, noticed holy under C, which you can see H-O-L-Y. Okay, now that one is spooky. No, I think all of these are coincidences. Whereas if we had a pot of alphabet soup and we lifted the lid and saw this, we would know for sure that that did not happen by accident, right? That cannot be a coincidence. And a child, again, would know that cannot be a coincidence. My brother or my sister had too much time on their hands, and they spelled this in pasta letters. Okay, we get it. Everyone gets it. Again, is there a way to show mathematically, and we're not going to do any scary math here, don't worry. Is there a way to show that actually not only do we get that, but it's true, and it has to be true? Because if we understand why it has to be true that that can't happen by accident, then we're prepared to apply that to things that are more interesting than a 5-letter word in alphabet soup. So let me show you very quickly a way that you could actually convince someone with a number that that cannot happen by accident. Put a grid of squares, superimpose it over this soup. And I've made my grid squares so that they're about the size of one of these pasta letters. And there are 23 of these grid squares here. And what you notice when I superimpose the grid like this is that there's something unusual, at least mildly unusual, about all 23 of these squares. 18 of them are unusual with respect to the rest of the soup because they've been cleared of letters, or virtually cleared of letters, right? So you have this cleared space that occupies 18 of these grid squares. And then, of course, the 5 grid squares in the middle are unusual, exceptional, atypical, because they have these 5 letters nicely lined up, and the 5 letters spell a word, and the word happens to relate to what we're looking at, pasta. So if we just do some rough math here, we could say that there are 18 squares that are unusual, sort of on the order of 1 in 10. In other words, if you go back and look at this soup away from the pasta, you would probably have to look at least 10 grid square areas before you find a clearing that's like one of those cleared 18 squares. So let's say 18 of the squares are unusual, like 1 in 10 unusual. So that's not strikingly unusual, just 1 in 10 unusual. And let's say that the 5 that have the PASTA letters are 1 in 100 unusual, meaning if you took just a bowl of alphabet soup and put that grid over it, you would have to look at about 100 squares before you get a letter that's exactly lined up, ready to spell a word, and particularly when you consider that it's going to have to be the right letters to actually spell a word, not gibberish, right? So if this is reasonable, and we don't need to worry about the exact numbers, you'll see that we have 18 squares that are 1 in 10 unusual and 5 squares that are 1 in 100 unusual, then that means the whole pattern is 1 in 10 to the 18th times 100 to the 5th unusual, okay? Because all we've done here is multiplied out the unusualness. We've got 23 things that are a little bit unusual, and you multiply it out, you get this. Well, that turns out to be, if you multiply it out, this. The whole pattern is 1 in 10 octillion unusual. That is frighteningly unusual. No one would think that those odds were beaten by chance. So here we have something rigorous where you do math, and it says, yes, the 4-year-old was right. Yes, when you looked at that and knew someone did it, you're right. And now we can do math, and it's the math of probability. There's no way that anyone could pour 10 octillion bowls of alphabet soup, and that's about how many you would have to pour if you wanted to see something like that. Okay, so if we go back to the origami crane, it's really a similar thing going on here. There are a whole bunch of steps required for folding an origami crane, 20 or so, because they've been abbreviated in this diagram, and every one of those steps is unlikely to happen by chance. If you can imagine throwing reams of paper into maybe an industrial size tumble dryer and throwing tennis shoes in there so that all kinds of things happen to the paper, it gets creased and it gets torn. Maybe one fold would be a 1 in a million occurrence if you did a lot of this, but to get the whole sequence of folds, that's the thing that becomes absolutely impossible. Just like multiplying those grid squares on the pasta, you multiply your 1 in a million 20 times, you have a very, very frightening improbability. You don't need a calculator, in other words, to get this. You just look at it. We're very good at seeing someone arranged this because there's too much happening here that couldn't happen by chance. Too many things had to go right here, which means someone had to make them go right. They couldn't just go right on their own. Okay, I'm going to give a summary of this, which is a bit of a mouthful in text. So I'm going to show it in 2 different sentences, and I'll read it slowly. The making of any whole thing that does something clever requires a great many parts to be arranged in a complementary way. Okay? Taken individually, Each of these parts is unlikely to be arranged correctly by chance, which makes the accidental occurrence of the whole thing fantastically unlikely. So the making of anything that requires lots of things to be arranged, the making of anything that does something clever, so some high-level function, it's always going to involve the arrangement of lots of things at lower levels in order to do this high-level thing. And even if some of these low-level things could happen by chance, they're all improbable. You always end up by multiplying these improbabilities with an extreme improbability for the top-level thing. And I call it fantastically improbable or fantastically unlikely to mean that it's literally the stuff of fantasy. You're only pretending if you think that these things can happen. They cannot happen in the real world. Well, here's a figure that I have borrowed from the book that puts a name to this property, this arrangement of things just so at the low levels in order to get something that works, that does something clever at the top level. I call it functional coherence. And the diagram really illustrates what I mean by it. So this is a more sort of rigorous interpretation of what I'm saying here in words. Here it is in picture. That top level circle, the biggest circle, is something that does something clever, some invention. It could be things that we don't normally think about as inventions, like a paragraph, okay? A paragraph is a high-level thing that does something. It is made of components underneath it, sentences, right? Those sentences are made of subcomponents, words, and those words are made of elementary constituents, which would be the letters of the alphabet, right? So in a paragraph, you have something that works. It does something, if you've written it well, if you're going to get a good grade on your paper, it better do something good at the paragraph level. And all kinds of things had to be done correctly down at the lower level of individual letters forming words, spelling them correctly, words put together to make phrases and sentences, sentences cohering at that top level to do the work of a paragraph. A paragraph is an invention that exhibits functional coherence, but so is everything else that we think of as an invention, every clever thing. Here's like a very dated 4-megapixel digital camera, if you remember when digital cameras only had 4 megapixels, or when anyone had a digital camera instead of a phone. But here's an illustration exactly of functional coherence, because when we look at that, or when you see it in operation, you know, hey, that's doing something clever, and that means I don't need to take it apart to know that it must have a whole bunch of things arranged inside it in order for it to do that, because all things that do a high-level thing in a clever way have all kinds of things underneath that have been arranged just so in order for them to do that. Now, I don't recommend you do this with your digital camera, but if you do, you'll find there they are, all the parts. And I can't name them. We may not be able to know what all of these things are doing, but you can be sure that every single thing that you have laid out in this diagram, this photograph, is a part that's performing some sub-function that allows that camera to perform its high-level function of taking digital photographs. And all of them are made of the materials they're made of and the shapes that they're made of in order for those sub-functions to work, in order for the whole camera to work. So you see lens components over on the right. You see, body components there in the middle. You see the display thing and the framing around the display. And somewhere in there is the little light capture device, the charge coupled device that allows this thing to receive light and produce a digital image out of it. Okay, now let's think about this and compare it to our analysis of the alphabet soup. If this is what you need in order to get a digital camera to work, it's a lot more than 5 pasta letters and a little clearing around. This is a whole lot that has to be put together. So how ridiculous would it be to think that something like this could happen by pure coincidence, that you could send like a Mars rover up and have it wandering around on Mars and it could bump into something like a digital camera that just happened by Martian geology. Well, you do get interesting shapes that are natural geological things. Minerals can form a beautiful variety of shapes and sizes. but you would search in vain as long as you wanted among these naturally formed mineral shapes to find something that could replace one of these components, right? And if you did, it'd be a real rig. I mean, like if you're missing a screw, maybe you could find a little thing that you could jam in that would take the place of a screw. But you can't start replacing these components with natural things because the probability of some natural shape being just right for any one of those camera functions is very low. And there were only 23 of those grid squares for the pasta spelled out in alphabet soup. There's a whole lot more than 23 items here, and each one of them is far less than a 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 to occur by natural processes, which means the whole thing put together is going to be far more scary a number than 1 in 10 octillion. 1 in 10 octillion was our probability for a simple 5-letter word in alphabet soup. This is going to be way, way beyond that, which means there's no way something like this could happen by purely natural processes operating on their own without anything having been conceived. And if that's true of this, which is complex, then imagine how much more true it is of these things, which are far more complex. And that's not in dispute. Nobody disputes that these are far more complex than things like this. People, after all, make these, right? We make things like this. Whereas if you take the most brilliant people in the world and give them $1 trillion budget and all the time they want, they will never come up with something like these, okay? So these are the things of true genius. And again, they epitomize this property called functional coherence in a way that even a paragraph or a digital camera don't. So yes, you can take the parts out and spread them out the way the camera parts were spread out of a human body in this case. But in the case of the camera, many of those pieces, like the body piece, it's just a hunk of plastic, right? So once you've got these pieces laid out for the Canon camera, you can't really zoom in anymore and see further layers of components within components. It's just one piece. Now, some of the pieces, like the chips, will have those components within components. In life, every single one of these components can itself be examined more and more deeply, and you find organs are made of tissues, tissues are made of cells, cells are made of organelles and molecules, all the way down to the molecular. You see this stunning array of complexity. So if we look at an eye over there over the arm, you see these two eyeballs staring at you spookily. If we look at one of those, we see the tissues that make up the eyeball, the retina, the sclera, the cornea, the vasculature, the lens. All of these need to be in their proper places in order for the eye to perform the function of the eye, in order for vision to work as vision, in order for us to work the way we're supposed to work. You can look in more closely than this at any one of those tissues, and you'll see cells that are arranged just so in order for the tissue to perform its function. So the retina is the light-gathering tissue at the back of the eye that's sort of the much more elegant version of the charge couple device in the Canon camera. And within that, we see the rod and the cone cells. You see the bottom shapes there, the sort of orange ones are the rod cells, and the more pointy ones are the cone cells. So we have an elegant, complex structure to the retinal tissue itself. And hinted at in this picture is that in each one of these cells, a rod cell or a cone cell, you've got its own hierarchy of complexity within that. So here is, I'm not looking at a rod cell or a cone cell here, but just a generic artist's rendition of an animal cell, a generic animal cell. If you've had cell biology, you'll know what some of these things are inside, but all I want to do is show the picture, and even if you haven't had cell biology, you look at it and go, wow, there's a lot to a cell, isn't there? There's a lot going on inside there. And interestingly, there is no generic animal cell, right? All of these are differentiated specialist cells. The rod cell is a rod cell and not a kidney cell. The kidney cell is a kidney cell, not a brain cell. They all do their specialist functions. They're that complicated, but more because they are specialized to do specific functions. Well, we can go further and further down, all the way down to the level of the molecules, and this is actually where I have spent many years working on some of these molecules. This is it's called an enzyme, so it's a protein complex that does chemistry. And this particular enzyme is the monster of all enzymes. It's made of protein and RNA. It's called the ribosome. And this is the machine with hundreds of pieces to it that reads along the message RNA. So you have a DNA double helix that gets transcribed into RNA, and then this is the machine that reads along the RNA and makes protein chains in order for these to fold and perform the functions within the cell, including this function, because all of the little curly things you see in here are protein chains that were made by a ribosome. So a ribosome is making the parts that make a ribosome. There are many smaller but also elegant proteins that are made by the ribosome. And these perform everything from the chemistry of the cell, thousands of different enzymes that do chemistry, structural scaffolds within the cell, microtubules within the cell, transport devices, things that walk along microtubules, all kinds of functions that are performed at the subcellular level are performed by proteins. I've given you just a sample here of the different shapes that these proteins come in. So that ribosome, the big monster ribosome machine, reads along an RNA, which is carrying genetic instructions to link together amino acids one by one. There's 20 different amino acids. It makes a long chain of these things that, if the properties are right, it folds into a shape. There are thousands of these shapes that have been cataloged. I'm just showing you a few here so you can see the variety in these shapes. And only by having the right shape does this thing become a tool within the cell, a machine within the cell. And some of these are literally motors, like 120,000 RPM motors that drive bacteria through solutions, or motors that make ATP by protons flowing through the membrane. And they only do what they do by being the right shape. The same being true of a motor that we would make, or the same being true of those pieces of the camera. They have to be shaped right, made of the right material to do what they do. Well, this is the level that we've been examining life at for many years. I want to talk about a result that was published in this journal, Journal of Molecular Biology, in 2004, so 14 years ago now, that was asking, well, you can see from the title, estimating the prevalence of protein sequences adopting functional enzyme folds. So really, that's a mouthful. It's a paper that reports results and does calculations that's aiming to find out how rare are the gene sequences that would allow an amino acid sequence to fold to form one of those functional proteins. Are these easy to get, or are they hard to get? And if they're hard to get, how hard are they to get? Can we put a number on it? And I did end up putting a number on it that was reported in that paper. And I'll give you the number, but I want to do a more visual illustration of how scary the number is. This is the enzyme that I was working on. It's called beta-lactamase. This is a single protein chain that, again, folds up to form a working structure. And this particular enzyme is the bad enzyme, as far as we're concerned, that breaks up, that allows bacteria to survive penicillin antibiotics. So if you are given a penicillin prescription and you're told to take, I don't know how many days course, like a 10-day course of it, and you find 5 days in, 4 days in, it's not working, it's probably because the bacteria that are infecting you have this enzyme, and they're chewing up the penicillin, so they survive the penicillin. Bad enzyme for us clinically, but a great enzyme to do experiments on of this kind, because what I was able to do is randomize, shuffle amino acids within this chain, and put these shuffled genes in bacteria by the hundreds of thousands or millions, and then put these bacteria out on Petri dishes that have a little bit of penicillin. And If this thing was broken, then they cannot form a colony because the penicillin will kill them. But if the shuffling gave a new version of sequence that still works, then they will form a colony because they can grow in the presence of penicillin. So it was a way to count what fraction of these randomized things still work, okay, and to put a number on it. And you can think of this number as, if you want to think about this happening by coincidence or by chance, then it's like hitting a target, right? Because the number, are we talking about 1 in a million? Then if you throw a million darts, you can hit a 1 in a million target. Are we talking about 1 in a billion? Then you have to throw a billion darts blindfolded, and you might hit a 1 in a billion target, right? So getting that number tells us how realistic or unrealistic chance is as an explanation for getting one of these proteins. Now, I'm going to tell you the number, but I first want to do sort of an illustration of, I want to give you a feel for the number. Okay, so we're going to do a little demo here that involves lasers. It's not dangerous. I do need a volunteer, and we're going to do a little laser light show. Anybody want to? Well, I can't see the ceiling, but you'll need. Can people see a dot on the ceiling if I do that? Okay, I can't because I have bright lights in my face. Do I have a volunteer who can just point a laser? Yes, you, in the back. Come to the front. Now, what we're going to do here, this is like finding a target, and it's going to be a small target, and the thing that's going to make it hard is you're not going to be looking. Oh, okay. But what you do need to do is not be aiming the laser down like this, because that will blind people. So just be roughly up. I'm going to put a dot on the ceiling somewhere. You won't know where it is. And then you just blindfolded kind of wander around on the ceiling, and we'll see if you can hit it. Yeah, we'll see if you can hit it. Okay. So I've got to get my laser going here and carefully make sure I'm not blinding anyone. And I'm going to set my tripod up here. Okay, but at this point, you need not watch. Turn around. No cheating. All right, now I cannot see because I've got this bright light. Okay. Is it there? Whoa. I've got to be doubly careful that I don't. Okay, I lost my. Can anyone see? Okay. Okay, so without looking, you're still not looking, you're just pointing up and then wandering around with your, and I'm going to have to, wandering around. Oh, yeah, okay. It's an interesting effect we're getting actually from actually, if you did this all day, okay, you can look now. Actually, mine is being hit by the fan blade, isn't it? Because it's like blinking. So the ceiling fan is cutting mine, and the dot is right there, which you can hardly see because of the bright lights. But if you aimed at it, you could hit it, but it's very hard to get it blindfolded, right? We're not looking, yes. Okay, so thank you to my assistant. That's the first time I've had a ceiling fan enter that experiment. Okay, so what is it about this that made that hard? I mean, there's a relative size of two things. There's a very small thing and a very big thing. The very small thing is the laser dot. What's the very big thing? The ceiling. And the laser dots are so small compared to the ceiling that if I fix a laser dot on this ceiling, it would take an awful long time of someone just blindly wandering around with a small laser dot because there's so much ceiling and so little laser dot. So that's a small target that has to be hit, and that makes it improbable. The improbability of hitting the target to get a functional protein, however, is way, way beyond this demonstration. So I wanted to give you an idea using that demonstration of how bad it really is for a chance to come up with a functional protein. Imagine not a normal laser dot of this size, but one that's pinpoint in size, and imagine the ceiling being not this ceiling, big though it is, but I believe this is the largest ceiling in the world, because that is the largest building, the Boeing Everett assembly plant, in terms of volume. So I think probably that is the largest ceiling. If you cleared out all the fuselages and wings and partitions and had a pinpoint size laser dot hidden somewhere on that ceiling, and our volunteer had to, walk around blindfolded with a pinpoint-sized laser dot and hope that it hit that target. You can imagine it could take a lifetime, couldn't it? Because that's such a large ceiling, and a pinpoint is so small. That is nothing like the difficulty of the problem that an accidental origin of life would run up against, and not even just the origin of life, but any change in life. Because as you produce any new kind of life, you need new proteins, and you need to be able to invent these things. And you would have to hit this target, and if that's going to happen by chance, then you have to hit targets like this by chance. To get to the number that was reported in that JMB article, we're talking about a target that is the size, what did I just do? A target that is size, not of a pinpoint, but of a hydrogen atom, which is quite a bit smaller than a pinpoint. And we're talking about a ceiling the size of the backdrop of the visible universe, okay? So to get one functional protein, imagine how hard this was. We're talking about hitting a hydrogen atom at the furthest reaches of the visible universe, okay? That is not going to happen by accident. Very big universe, very small hydrogen atom. Okay, now, that is the magnitude of the coincidence that is being claimed when people claim that single protein molecules just happens. They're claiming that magnitude of coincidence. And you could point that out to someone in conversation and say, that doesn't sound like the sort of coincidence. That doesn't sound like the sort of thing that could happen by coincidence. But remember, that's one protein molecule. To do anything in life, you need whole suites of these things. So it'd be like hitting that hydrogen atom many, many, many times, thousands of times in a row. There's no way that can happen by accident. Now, if you talk to a biologist, there will be all kinds of things that are raised. You didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that, did Acts mention this or that? Really, the whole point of this approach is to convince you and others that although it's perfectly okay to go and study those technical things in great detail, you don't need to do that to be assured that life cannot be an accident. If even a single component of life, a single molecule of life cannot be an accident, then living things themselves certainly cannot be accidental. Here is the basic idea. You don't need to dive into any of those technical, detailed things in order to understand this. These are the things of life, and these are the things that we rightly attribute to genius. And even someone who says, ultimately, these are not the products of genius, ultimately, these came about a different way. Even those people say, yes, those look like the products of genius. You have to, because take all the geniuses you want, and they can't make anything like that. These are definitely the products of genius. They appear that way. That's totally legitimate. If someone wants to say that they're not the products of genius, that they're actually the products of accidental causes, blind causes that could not conceive of them, then that amounts to a claim of coincidence, because it's a claim that a cause that is as far removed from genius as can be, accidental, chance, stupidity here, genius here, if you're claiming that this did what this ordinarily does, you are claiming a coincidence, because this doesn't normally do what this does, right? Stupid things don't normally do what brilliance does. So this is a claim of coincidence. And the interesting thing about this is you can't get rid of this. You can add any number of layers of complexity to your theories of evolutionary biology, but at the end of the day, if you're claiming that chance did what genius does, you're claiming a coincidence. And probability is the math of coincidence. There's no way out of this. There's no way out of this. Okay, all you can do is try to conceal the coincidence and pretend that it's not there, shift it around. It's the shell game, basically. So let me give you some examples of this. Let's ask, how might this unbelievable coincidence be resolved? And I'm going to give you two very popular ways that are thrown out there as solutions to unbelievable coincidence, both of which are false. They're both of which are examples of this shell game, okay? They're just dodging the coincidence. They're not actually resolving it. And then after these two, I'm going to give you the only two honest, bona fide ways to resolve any kind of coincidence. So here are the shell game possibilities. How might this unbelievable coincidence be resolved? Well, one proposal, and it's a very common one, is by identifying immediate physical causes. In other words, you'll see people arguing as though if I can tell you something physical that is an immediate explanation of that, then I've removed the coincidence. But that is simply not true. That is a shell game. So if we're looking up at the sky and we see this, and you say, hey, someone did some skywriting, and your friend says, I don't think so, because look, there's clouds there, and all you need is particulates up in the sky that reflect the sunlight in the blue background, and you're going to see the reflected particulates. And I don't think that requires anyone to have done that. That could just happen naturally. There's clouds all over. That could happen naturally. And you say, well, I grant that I'm looking at particulates. I'm not saying that I'm looking at something that's not physical. But in order for those particulates to be arranged in the shape of a heart, that requires something beyond just the things that explain the other clouds, right? Someone had to arrange this physical system in order to do this. And indeed, I had to Photoshop it to remove the people who arranged it, because it's those little stunt planes. The people in the stunt planes arranged this heart, and that's the only way you get skywriting. So the mere fact that there is something physical does not remove the unbelievable coincidence. When you're saying someone must have drawn that heart in the sky, you're not saying there isn't a physical explanation for the heart being there. You're saying that design has to be behind that physical explanation. Someone had to arrange the circumstances in order for that to produce a heart, which is not the same as for an ordinary cloud. So that doesn't work. Just by identifying immediate physical causes, you have not removed the coincidence. Another very often used attempt to resolve the unbelievable coincidence is this one, by dividing the big coincidence into smaller ones, okay? So the idea is, sure, the improbability of getting that whole thing is staggering, but what if it happened in lots of little steps, okay? And this is the classic Darwinian explanation. It's actually shown to be wrong right here, because that's exactly what we did here, is we took the big thing and we divided it into little things. And we found here that even though those little improbabilities are not spooky improbabilities, 1 in 10 is not a spooky improbability, it's the bringing of them all together to get the finished thing that is a spooky improbability, if you want to think that it happened by chance. It's the bringing of all those 1 in 10, 1 in 100 together that gave us 1 in 10 octillion. So you don't make improbability go away by dividing it. You simply get a bunch of numbers that, when multiplied, give you that original scary improbability, okay? So you can't simply divide these. You get the same improbability if you do divide them. And it's not as though you can, in evolution, explain the big thing, the living organisms of all these different kinds, in terms of partial solutions. It's not, if we had poured the bowl of alphabet soup and seen one little clearing, we wouldn't have had something amazing, okay? There wouldn't have been something worth looking at. It's only because all of those things come together and make something that's functionally coherent that it's worth commenting on, and that is too improbable to happen by accident. So it is with evolutionary biology. Natural selection does not give partial credit, okay? There is fitness, which means you are a fully fledged organism that can survive on your own, and you're fit. If you're not fit, you don't get partial credit. You get the grade that not fit gets, and you don't even get, you don't even get a world that's trying to help you to become fit. Okay, in the Darwinian view, if you're not fit, you're dead, you're extinct, and there's nothing that's trying to help you to become more fit. So dividing a big coincidence into smaller ones does not work either. Both of these are examples of the shell game. And I said there are two and only two legitimate ways to resolve an unbelievable coincidence, and they are these. One, or at least to try to resolve it. One is if there were enough time, conceivably, when you have something that's improbable, like winning the lottery, if you play enough times, although it's improbable that you'll win on any one try, right? If you buy enough tickets, I don't recommend it, but if you buy enough tickets, you can win the lottery, right? Because it's those small probabilities add up, and if you have enough opportunities, what was a very small probability can become a significant probability. However, is that going to work? Well, we just looked at the alphabet soup. If it's 1 in 80 octillion, do you think it's even possible to have 80 octillion bowls of alphabet soup? No, you've way run out of all the possible materials for making alphabet soup long before you got to that. Even the most staunch Darwinist that I know alive today, Richard Dawkins, recognizes that you don't have enough time to solve this problem. So this is a quote from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which was influential in my coming to this problem. I read this as a graduate student because all my peers said, here is the book that shows that life evolved and will forever be the end of claims that God made life. And I thought, wow, I've got to read that book then. Very good read. It was as good a piece of writing as he's done, and it's become much more sort of nasty since then. But back then, I think he believed what he was saying. He wrote this in The Blind Watchmaker: however many ways there may be of being alive, it is certain that there are vastly more ways of being dead, or rather not alive. You may throw cells together at random over and over again for 1 billion years, and not once will you get a conglomeration that flies or swims or burrows or runs or does anything, even badly, that could remotely be construed as working to keep itself alive. He is saying that time is not the solution. The improbabilities are too extreme here for getting the things that work, like what we see in life, that time cannot be the solution. Richard Dawkins is acknowledging that time is not the solution. Now, what does he think is the solution? He thinks the key word here is at random, and that because natural selection is not random, he thinks it overcomes this improbability. But in these very words of his, you can see why natural selection is not the solution to this. Can you see this? He's having to overcome the problem that all these arrangements don't even do anything even badly that could remotely be construed as working to keep the organism alive, but that's exactly the problem you have to solve before you have natural selection, right? Because the only things that get selected are the things that have done this, that overcome this improbability. So natural selection cannot be the way they overcome this improbability. Well, you can take Dawkins' word for it that time is not the solution. I've done the math for one subset of this problem, and definitely there is not enough time. Billions of years is not enough time to solve these problems. So I said there are two legitimate ways to overcome the unbelievable coincidence. This one is legitimate, but then you have to do the math to see whether it actually works. And in this case, there's no way you can overcome this kind of improbability, this kind of coincidence with time. The only other solution is this: by acknowledging genius as the cause. In other words, you resolve this coincidence, which truly is unbelievable, and it should be unbelievable, and it's mathematically unbelievable. You resolve it this way: by getting rid of chance as the cause and acknowledging what the 4-year-old saw, that genius is the cause of these things. That's the only solution. So I draw to a conclusion, and then we'll have some time for questions. The conclusion is that unbelievable coincidences are unbelievable for a very good reason. Thank you very much.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. Why don't you take a seat?
Okay.
What we're going to do right now, we're going to transition to our Q&A time. And what we want to do is we want to invite you, if you desire